Hi, I'm Bajana Barker. This is my oral presentation on identifying at-risk youth, infants, and toddlers, focusing on disabilities for this class for Human Behavior and Social Environment 1, taught by Professor Walsh. In order to provide appropriate intervention within the family-centered model, the social worker must be aware and respect differences in beliefs and values based on culture. The social worker who provides intervention in the home and has an intimate view of such things as customs, eating habits, and child rearing practices that may vary among cultures. Though examples, statistics, videos, and lessons learned in my class currently, I intend to identify the population of infants and toddlers in America who are at risk based on multi-factors centered on cultural differences, as well as possible ways of addressing these differences when providing services. Understanding the language is not the only culturally based barrier, is only the beginning. Our barriers that may hinder in the service provision process are racial-based differences, religious beliefs, ethnic backgrounds, and cultural traditions, and many others. Although there are quite a few different approaches to overcoming these barriers to services, we will focus mainly on the ecological theory as well as Erikson's theory, and how thus providing the family with the realization that they are involved in their child's care and also helping to remove some of the possible cultural barriers that may exist, mainly by showing and obtaining help to their child's care is not a weakness, especially if they are directly involved in overseeing the help. Identifying barriers to services based on different cultures. Every culture has its own history in regards to social development. Very few countries or cultures have advanced to the point of completely tolerance and acceptance of children with disabilities. As you will see here, many cultures still actively practice the shunning of people with disabilities and still perceive them as defective pariahs on their society, unable to provide for themselves and undesirable. Ethnic barriers and differences. The following is a brief look at just a few cultures which differ significantly from the norm American culture. China. For generations, the Chinese have mandated a one-child rule in effort to both control the population growth and to control gender growth. The Chinese society for a long time put forth a greater value on the family having boys for their strict family planning roles. Although this still exists to some degree, laws in China were very recently changed, and we will have to wait to see what effects this will have on the Chinese viewpoint. It should also be noted that the Chinese suffer from a lack of ununified welfare system. If there is such a system, perhaps many people would be abandoning their children. In many cases, families have escaped the situation in order to obtain health care for their disabled child, and therefore showing the families that the necessary help is available, along with the insurance to help pay for it, will be the biggest way to overcome these barriers that still exist. South Africa. For generations, South Africans' attitude toward disabilities was inexplicably linked to apartheid. Here, the struggles lies largely with the vast differences between the classes of society. The overwhelming power classes are powerful, simple, because they are seen as professionals, the expert, and that if they are not expert, you will be perceived as inferior members of the team. If you are all perceived as members of the team, in recent years, South Africa has adopted characteristics that see the problem within the individual and that the expert focus on the changing the individual to fit into their needs society. The institutions of the disability is no one's fault but yours own, but will be accepted only if you conform to the society as a whole. This phrase is extreme, does not question the status quo of society. segregation into special institutions, separate and often unequal facilities such as transport, shelter, workshops, schools, and homes are not questioned, but rather the individual is shaped to fit into the divided. Apartheid-like society, unfortunately, South Africa is satisfied it has reached this level of maturity, and professionals are instructed to prepare the disabled for the lifestyle. When faced in this cultural belief system, it may be most valuable to show the families that there are societies of inclusions, given them the examples of average disabled Americans, and show them that by providing the services needed for their children or child will now be instrumental in helping them to achieve their fullest potential by contributing members of society as an adult. Russia. As long as most older Russians can remember, children with developmental disabilities such as Down syndrome and cerebral palsy were mostly taken away from their families and put into institutions. They received little, if any, education. Back in the Soviet times, there were no expectations that children with intellectual disabilities would go to school. If they stayed in their families, and that was unlikely, there were all kinds of negative stereotypes about the children with disabilities. So these people were very isolated from the community. There is no such thing as making the community accessible. No one ever thought about that. Although Russian society has been considerably blind to children with disabilities for a very long time, the attitude in recent years are changing. While the attitudes towards physical and developmental disabilities are still struggling to move forward, there are a couple of disabled populations which have been accepted within the society. People who are blind or deaf have been receiving helps since the 1920s and are, for the most part, educated and accepted into the society. Today, the thought process of learning heavily toward the fact that the disabled children need to be integrated into ordinary schools, there can be interact with the society. However, that argument does not always work, as Russia still has special educators who will still argue that the disabled child is still better off in the older institutions where they will not be a burden to society. While the overall attitude is changing in Russia, all of you have to do is look around and you will realize that they still have a lot of work to do. This is very seldom that the disabled person is seen in the public, as once they are released from the institution at the ages of 18, 19, or 20 years without the necessities, education, it is still next to impossible for them to get a job. While the official Russian law is that the organizations are required to provide employment for the disabled, it is also stipulates that it must have the proper education for the job. The institutions do not provide such education, and therefore the disabled cannot get a job. Religion-based barriers differences. Although many societies may not generally discriminate actively towards children with disabilities, a considerable number of religious and faiths do. It may surprise you to know that many of the more well-known religion is not only is it acceptable to discriminate against people with disabilities, but it is encouraged, in some instances, even blame the person with the disability for bringing it upon themselves. Hindu. The Hindu doctrine of samsara connects individuals' differences to actions performed in the past life. It is widely believed that the Hindu faith that a person is rewarded or punished in the life according to what he or she has done in the past life, so referred to as karma. It is therefore believed that the more significant the child's disability is, the worse the crimes were in the past life. In 2007, the World Bank survey, around half of the respondents believe that disability is always mostly a curse from God. The ideology has gone as far as the clergy in some extremist temples and has gone as far as to deny the entry of a disabled person. Buddhism. Popular understanding based on the idea of karma has provided the ability for people to rationalize their attitudes toward people with disabilities. Reforms in Japan bitterly blame Buddhism for such the superadded suffering of disabled people beyond the physical suffering directly caused by their disability. Christianity. Although Christianity outwardly teaches tolerance and acceptance to all those who accept Jesus, however, their own scriptures led to confusions in regards to disability. In one passage, Jesus heals a paralyzed man by saying to him, "Take heart, son, your sins are forgiven." Matthew 9, verse 2 and 7. This indicates that because of his sins, the man was paralyzed, making the disability a punishment from God, which can only be taken away through God's forgiveness. The above examples are just a small example of the various cultural-based barriers that can exist when trying to access a child with a disability. These barriers, whether cultural or religious, by the very nature, place the infant or toddler in need of services into an at-risk category. In many, if not all, these examples of cultural beliefs or traditions either place blame on the child or their families for the disability, or they instill the ideology that the child with a disability should either be ignored, hidden, abandoned, or otherwise treated as a non-member of society. All of these actions can usually lead to the disabled child being at risk. I will be posting links to a couple of videos I feel will be appropriate to see after the presentation. When providing services for at-risk population, infants and toddlers, it is crucial for social workers to be able to provide the assessment of services to a child's home. Being able to observe the family's tradition, cultural, child rearing, surroundings, and practices will greatly help in being able to provide comprehensive services. It will also give the social worker invaluable information in which to draw upon when researching possible plans of actions regarding the infant-toddler service plans. They are better able to truly determine if the child is at risk from other factors besides the disabilities. Such are they being neglected or abused? Is the family taking appropriate care of the hygiene needs of the infant or toddler? Does the family have the appropriate food to feed the child? Or does the family interact with the child? All of these questions and more are vital in being able to assess the family's ability to become actively involved in the child's service plan. Assessing theories and perspectives. Ecological theory. Originally developed by Urie Bronfenbrenner in 1979, the ecological theory explains human development by describing aspects of individual, the environment, the interactions between the two. His theory states that people are actively involved in their development, that both the individual's development and the environment are always changing. It also explains that people are born with both positive and negative tendencies, and that the individual is influenced by both nature as well as nurture. Finally, Bronfenbrenner says that his theory is driven by the fact that how people perceive their surroundings and events that happen to them will be determined how the individual will develop. The ecological theory is broken into two different sets of systems. The interactions of an individual has a particular level. There are 4 systems within this theory as they go as follows.